Under the late afternoon haze of coastal California sun, Mark Drayden stood barefoot in the center of his rooftop terrace, sipping lukewarm coffee from a chipped ceramic mug that had followed him through 3 relocations and 2 long-term relationships. The wind rolled over the Pacific and onto the shingles above his home, nudging the corners of a canvas tarp he hadn't yet secured. Below him, the street was silent, save for the faint hum of an electric lawnmower 2 houses down. For the first time in weeks, the house felt still. Not peaceful, that had long stopped being the right word, but still, and that was something. The rooftop itself was something of an obsession. Reinforced with steel support columns and designed with a subtle, almost imperceptible gradient, it served both as a retreat and a reservoir. Not for water, but for Mark's need for control in a world where control had long become negotiable. The decking was imported wood, treated against warping. The perimeter was bordered by a custom-made railing that Mark had commissioned out of black anodized aluminum, not because it was cheaper or stronger, but because it was the only thing that didn't interrupt the view of the ocean. Below the surface of the wooden slats was a hydraulic tilt mechanism, a leftover from a scrapped water reclamation project he had consulted on during his brief stint in environmental engineering. He'd installed it himself over 3 weeks of precision work, not with any dramatic function in mind, but as a sort of fail-safe, just in case. The terrace was private, not metaphorically, not aspirationally. Legally, physically, intentionally private. There was no public access, no shared wall, no communal easement, no conceivable reason why anyone other than Mark would ever be up there. It had a single point of access, a reinforced hatch leading up from the master bedroom, secured with an interior deadbolt. The roof was his refuge, the only place in the house untouched by outside compromise. It was not a space designed for company, let alone community. And yet, as Mark stood there now, he noticed 3 wine-glass rings staining the wood near the northwest edge, faint but unmistakable. He crouched down, rubbing his thumb over one of them. It was fresh. Not from this morning's sun, but perhaps last night's. Next to the rings was a single partial footprint, likely from a woman's wedge heel. There were other signs, too. A faint trace of ash on the windward corner, perhaps from a cigar or clove cigarette. A scuff on the railing. One of the solar-powered floor lights twisted slightly out of alignment, like someone had bumped it while turning around. None of it made sense. He hadn't had visitors, not even deliveries, in over a week, and no one, absolutely no one, had access to the inside of his home while he was away. He'd been at a colleague's retirement dinner up in Santa Barbara for 2 days, and his security system showed no breach, no alerts, no motion-detected footage. Which could only mean one thing. Whoever had been up here hadn't come through the house. They had found another way in. Mark didn't panic. He wasn't the panicking type, but a cold, structured sort of focus began to tighten in his chest, the way it used to when he'd run failure simulations in the early days of his consulting career. He walked the perimeter of the terrace slowly, methodically. His eyes scanned the roofline, the parapet edges, the neighboring properties. Nothing seemed out of place. But the back corner of the deck, the one facing the Henderson property next door, was separated by less than 6 feet of vertical clearance. A determined person could potentially move from their upper balcony to his rooftop, assuming they were agile and had no regard for personal boundaries or trespassing laws. It had to be her, Karen Henderson. Late 50s, always in coordinated pastels, constantly armed with a clipboard and that smile, the one that didn't quite reach her eyes. She wasn't just a neighbor. She was the de facto, self-appointed head of the neighborhood association, despite not being elected nor officially authorized. Karen was the kind of woman who could tell you the exact color code of your mailbox and the decibel range of your air conditioning unit, and would gladly do so, unsolicited. Mark had tried to stay civil, to remain invisible even. He nodded when necessary, never lingered in conversation, never objected publicly when she floated new community rules under the guise of resident suggestions. He didn't have the patience for neighborhood politics. He paid his dues. He maintained his property. He kept to himself. But Karen had always viewed silence as an opening, not a boundary. Later that evening, Mark reviewed the footage from his outdoor cameras. The front gate, garage, side pathway, all empty, all clear. But the rooftop didn't have camera coverage. He'd always considered it unnecessary. It was secure, self-contained. No one could possibly get up there without his knowledge. That assumption now felt naive. Instead of patching together guesses, Mark opened his laptop and drafted a short email to a private security contractor he'd worked with once before during a commercial retrofit project. He wasn't interested in making accusations, not yet, but he wanted a proper rooftop review. External audit. New lock for the hatch. Possibly thermal motion detection near the property line. He wasn't going to start a war, but he wasn't about to be blindsided again, either. 2 days later, a printed letter arrived. Not an email, not a phone call, hand-delivered and placed in his mailbox. It bore the familiar emblem of the neighborhood association, printed in dark green ink. The letterhead was clean, professional, and utterly ridiculous. It read, "Notification of Shared Space Review. It has come to our attention that the rooftop of 7427 Mirador Lane has been used by several community members during the recent Sunset social gathering. Per the Architectural Overlay Addendum, 1984, rooftops formerly designated as communal observation points may be considered open use during HOA-sanctioned events. Please ensure that your space is maintained in accordance with community visual and safety standards." Mark reread the letter 3 times, blinking in slow disbelief. Sunset, social gathering, open-use rooftop, architectural overlay from 1984. The house wasn't even built until 1996. His rooftop wasn't public, wasn't communal, wasn't open for anything. And no part of the letter referenced permission, no apology, no prior notice. It was, in essence, a formal shrug disguised as a policy. Mark folded the letter in half and set it on his desk. He didn't crumple it. That would imply emotion, reaction. He wouldn't give Karen that kind of satisfaction. Instead, he printed out his property survey, permit history, and structural zoning exemptions. Facts, boundaries, proof. That night, from the second-floor window, Mark noticed the faint glow of candlelight flickering again from the western edge of his rooftop. Just a glint, quickly extinguished, like someone had seen him watching. He didn't move, didn't reach for his phone. He simply stood there, still barefoot, still holding that same chipped mug, now cold and dry. The roof was no longer just his. Someone had decided it belonged to the neighborhood. And for the first time in years, Mark felt the sharp return of a very old instinct. Not fear, not quite anger, but the urge to build higher walls, lock deeper gates, and find out exactly who thought they had the right to walk over what was his. It was a Thursday morning when Mark found the second envelope. Unlike the first, this one wasn't neatly folded into his mailbox. It was slid halfway beneath his front doormat, damp from the morning marine layer, as if someone had delivered it quietly without wanting to be noticed. The paper was heavier than standard, textured like parchment. No return address, just a printed gold seal of the neighborhood committee in the top left corner, and his name written in calligraphic script that screamed artificial elegance. Not for formality's sake, but for performance. He stood there barefoot on the concrete, mug in hand, the same mug he always drank from, because mornings didn't change, not even when everything else was beginning to feel wrong. The weight of the paper was unnecessary. He knew who sent it. The letter began with what sounded like praise. "Your rooftop terrace has quickly become one of the most admired features of the community, both architecturally and socially." That sentence alone nearly made him laugh if he hadn't felt the familiar tightening in the back of his neck. Admired? He had built it as a sanctuary, not a showroom. The next paragraph struck harder. It explained that the committee, led by resident liaison Karen Henderson, had received several requests to formalize the use of his rooftop for community-centered recreational events, citing the prior week's informal sunset gathering as a resounding success. The letter was peppered with neutral administrative language, shared space optimization, underutilized elevation assets, passive engagement platforms, phrases that attempted to mask what was, at its core, a violation dressed up in civic jargon. Then came the real blow. A footnote referencing a reinterpretation of the 1984 overlay document, a dusty piece of zoning nostalgia that had no legal binding on Mark's modern structure. According to the committee, certain elevated parcels within the original layout were labeled as potential communal observatories, an absurd term that no modern homeowner would take seriously. Yet somehow, this misapplied, outdated artifact was now being used as the cornerstone for a push to make his roof legally accessible, or at least publicly useful. He read the paragraph twice, then a third time, trying to determine whether this was some kind of mistake, or worse, a test balloon meant to see how far they could push him before he pushed back. Karen's fingerprints were all over it. The language too polite, too non-confrontational, designed specifically to provoke without seeming to. Later that afternoon, Mark walked the perimeter of his home, checking sightlines and vertical clearances, recalculating the potential entry points. He noticed that the decorative trellis attached to the side of Karen's house extended further than he remembered, almost grazing the fence line that separated their properties. She wouldn't have used it herself. The incline was too steep for someone in her 60s, but she had help. Her nephew, perhaps. The lanky one who was always fiddling with her gutter or backing his truck into her yard like he lived there. It wouldn't be hard for someone nimble to climb from her balcony, cross the boundary wall, and pull themselves onto the terrace. A 10-minute job, less if they'd done it before. He didn't call the police. This wasn't criminal trespass in the textbook sense. There was no broken entry, no surveillance footage, no damage, only the nauseatingly civil insinuation that it was somehow their right. He called his attorney instead. Gwen Saunders, direct, unflinching, and chronically unimpressed by suburban politics. After listening to him read the letter aloud, she paused only once to ask, "Have they physically altered anything?" Number. Have you explicitly revoked permission for anyone to be up there? Yes, not that it was ever granted. Good, she said, her voice even. We'll draft a cease and desist. I'll reference the title boundaries and the permit code for your structure. You might also want to install external-facing motion sensors. If they want to turn this into a game of paper, we can play, but we'll use real paper. It helped hearing someone take the nonsense seriously. Still, Mark didn't feel better. He felt watched. That night, the rooftop was empty, but something had shifted in the way the house breathed. Every sound became sharper, every creak more suspect. Mark sat in his office, half listening to the wind, the other half rereading the committee's letter and jotting questions in the margin. He had worked in risk mitigation for over a decade, helping companies identify which part of their infrastructure would collapse first under pressure. This, though, felt different. There were no spreadsheets, no budget ceilings or force diagrams. It was pettiness dressed as protocol. And yet it carried weight because it came from people who believed deeply in their right to redefine boundaries, not based on law, but on entitlement. By the weekend, it escalated. A flyer appeared on the community bulletin, a folded piece of glossy cardstock headlined, "Wine and Watch, Rooftop Sundown Social, BYOG, Bring Your Own Glass." It featured a photograph of his house, his actual house, cropped tastefully from an angle that revealed the terrace bathed in sunset light, with text inviting residents and their guests to enjoy a shared view experience unlike any other. The fine print at the bottom clarified, "This gathering operates under provisional spatial interpretation as per committee memo 27. B. The audacity was staggering. They didn't just admit they were using his property, they were advertising it. Mark stormed into his living room, flyer in hand, and called Gwen. "They've printed invitations now," he said, pacing, "with my house on it." She didn't miss a beat. "Did you receive a direct notice, or was it a general circulation?" "It was posted on the bulletin board." "Okay," she said calmly. "That actually helps. We can document public distribution, attach a copy to the notice of revocation. I'll include the image as unauthorized use of personal property." "What if they show up?" he asked, quieter now. "If they show up again?" "Then we'll have cause," she said. "But you're not to physically interfere. Not yet. Let them cross the line. Then we respond." Her voice, as always, was cool and surgical, but she didn't live next door to the people who believed they were doing him a favor by invading his space. When Sunday arrived, Mark installed 2 new motion-activated lights on the corners of the terrace, calibrated just bright enough to ruin the mood but not trigger any city violations. He placed small vinyl signs near the base of the hatch and railing posts. "Private area. No access beyond this point. Secured entry." Harmless, non-aggressive, perfectly lawful. He even took photos of them, time-stamped for the record, but he did one more thing, quietly, without telling Gwen. He reset the rooftop hydraulic system's failsafe, adjusting the default angle from neutral to a 10-degree forward tilt. It wouldn't cause harm. The system moved too slowly for that. But it would make standing uncomfortable, make wine glasses slide, make furniture creak and shift. He told himself he wouldn't activate it unless absolutely necessary. But it helped to know it was there. A silent message no letter could deliver. A line drawn not in ink, but in architecture. That night, as the neighborhood lights flickered off one by one, Mark stayed awake, sitting by the bedroom window that faced the hatch, waiting not for someone to arrive, but for the moment he'd stop giving them the benefit of the doubt. The next weekend arrived without incident, and for a brief, fragile moment, Mark allowed himself to believe that the warning signs and motion lights had done their job. Not because he expected them to dissuade someone like Karen permanently, but because they at least reintroduced a consequence, a small but necessary friction to a campaign that had, until now, unfolded with the careless confidence of someone convinced they could not be challenged. The roof remained quiet, untouched. Mark resumed his daily routines, watering the succulents by the window, cataloging parts in his garage, even driving along the coast in the late afternoons just to feel like the world outside the neighborhood still existed and wasn't reduced to bylaws and wine-stained property lines. He didn't let his guard down exactly, but he began to compartmentalize again. That subtle skill of pushing the pressure out of your lungs and into a folder you promise to revisit later. But on the following Tuesday morning, an anonymous envelope arrived. No return name, no official seal, just his address scrawled in uneven handwriting across the front. He opened it at the kitchen counter thinking it might be a flyer or another petty notice. Instead, he found 5 printed photographs. Not digital copies, not screenshots, but glossy, high-resolution prints. Each one was a snapshot of his rooftop from different angles. 3 of them were taken at sunset, with clusters of people standing around his furniture, glasses in hand, facing the horizon. The other 2 were taken in daylight, with Karen herself gesturing toward the edge of the terrace as if delivering a tour. One photo showed her pointing toward Mark's mounted light fixtures, her hand on her hip, mouth mid-sentence. These were not candid images. They were documentation, proof not only that Karen had orchestrated at least 2 separate events on his roof without his knowledge, but that she had done so with the sort of confidence one exhibits when they believe they are above objection. His stomach turned. He flipped each photo over to check for markings, timestamps, anything to place the context. The backs were blank. No handwriting, no signature, just images. Clear, undeniable, and quietly menacing. This wasn't a mistake anymore. This was ownership. Not legal ownership, not even financial, but social, symbolic, territorial. They were treating his property as a backdrop for performance, a platform for wine culture and polite conversations about sustainable living and sea breeze humidity, none of which had any business existing on his private roof. He placed the envelope in a plastic sleeve, labeled it, and stored it in the folder with Gwen's letters. Then he made a second copy and locked it in his filing cabinet. That afternoon, he received a call from the neighborhood maintenance subcontractor, a man named Ray, whom Mark had met once or twice during earlier inspection rounds. Ray's voice was hesitant, not unsure, but measured. "Hey, Mark, listen, I just wanted to give you a heads up," he began. "There was some kind of meeting this morning with Karen and a few others from the board. They were talking about roof access, especially your place. Something about installing permanent community fixtures up there. Maybe a shade structure or some benches. I didn't catch all of it. Just thought you'd want to know." Mark asked for specifics, but Ray was vague. They didn't mention your name directly, just referred to it as the ideal shared vantage point. You know how they are. They talk like everything's already decided. Mark thanked him, hung up, and immediately called Gwen. By now, Gwen's tone had evolved from professional detachment to quiet incredulity. "They're escalating faster than expected," she said. "If they attempt physical modifications, that crosses into structural interference. We can go to court with that. I'll start preparing a restraining letter in case they proceed. But Mark, you should know, from a litigation standpoint, we need to catch them in the act." That sentence lingered. Not in the act of trespass, which was murky, but in the act of alteration. Invasion, after all, is easier to defend when it looks like improvement. The next day, Mark took photographs of every corner of his terrace, the railing, the planters, the storage box, the light fixtures. He printed time-stamped photos, created a file with serial numbers of every fixture, and saved copies on a USB drive which he stored inside a locked toolbox in his garage. Documentation wasn't paranoia. It was armor. 2 nights later, it happened. Mark had fallen asleep in his upstairs reading chair, a book still open in his lap, when the motion light on the roof tripped. He woke up instantly. Years of risk mitigation had trained his body to respond before his brain even finished the sentence. He moved quietly, no sudden gestures, no lights. He slipped into the hallway, past the hatch entrance, and crept to the bedroom window that faced the terrace. 2 silhouettes were visible on the deck. One stood near the railing, the other knelt beside the main light fixture, a toolkit open beside them. Karen wasn't there, but she didn't need to be. Whoever these people were, they were working with permission. Quiet, practiced movements, not vandals. Volunteers. Mark didn't open the window. He didn't shout. Instead, he picked up his phone and started filming from behind the curtain. He caught their movements, the tools, the moment one of them opened a metal bracket attached to his floodlight and began replacing the bulb with something different, warmer, more diffused, ambient, for mood lighting. He recorded the replacement, then zoomed in on their faces. One was the nephew. The other, someone he didn't recognize, maybe a guest from the wine event. When they moved toward the far end of the roof, he quietly unlocked the hatch and activated the hydraulic failsafe. The floor began to shift by degrees. Not fast, not dangerous, but enough to disorient. The men froze. One grabbed the railing. The other looked around, panicked. Mark remained silent. He waited exactly 30 seconds, then returned the system to neutral. No harm, no words, no warning, just a message. The intruders left within minutes, stepping cautiously back onto the neighboring balcony like nothing had happened. Mark didn't chase them. He didn't need to. The next morning, he filed an incident report with Gwen and forwarded the video. She didn't ask why he hadn't called the police. She understood the difference between resolution and escalation. Instead, she filed an injunction request for property interference. That evening, Mark returned to his rooftop and found, for the first time, a note placed gently on his side table. Folded once, no envelope. The handwriting was cursive and unmistakably Karen's. It read, "I understand your reaction. But a community is built on contribution, not isolation. We all give a little. I hope you'll reconsider." He didn't respond. Instead, he ordered industrial-grade anchors for the base of his railing and consulted a private contractor to reinforce the roof's edge with a tamper-resistant coating. He stopped thinking of the terrace as a place to relax. It had become a threshold, a fault line. And he knew that if they came back, it wouldn't be to share a view. It would be to claim the rest. The next morning came heavy with the kind of silence that doesn't imply calm, but rather anticipation, as though the house itself was bracing for the next intrusion. Mark didn't open the rooftop hatch. He didn't even look up at it. Instead, he brewed his coffee, sat in his kitchen, and listened. To the floorboards, to the old pipes, to the creaking rhythm of the house settling into itself. The hydraulic floor remained untouched since the last adjustment. Gwen had already submitted the injunction paperwork, and although there was no immediate hearing date, the legal wheels were turning. That should have given him some peace. It didn't. He knew people like Karen didn't wait for rulings or decisions. They moved through gray areas and back doors, convincing themselves that civic intent excused personal trespass. She wasn't building a case. She was building precedent. By midweek, flyers began reappearing. This time, they weren't stapled to public boards or slipped into mailboxes. They were printed as inserts in the neighborhood's monthly newsletter, a publication that most residents ignored unless they needed a reminder about trash collection changes. But this edition had a new feature, a column titled Elevated Together, Shared Spaces, and Shared Vision, authored by Karen herself. The column made no direct reference to Mark by name, but it didn't need to. "We have a rare opportunity to lead by example," it read, "by embracing the elevation we share, the view that belongs to all of us, and the spirit of openness that defines truly vibrant communities." The language was soft, almost poetic. It was calculated. It painted dissent as selfishness, solitude as regression. Mark read it twice, slowly, then placed it next to the original 1984 overlay, the one she had somehow resurrected as justification for what amounted to state-sanctioned trespassing. That night, Gwen called with an update. Their lawyer finally responded. "They're claiming it was a misunderstanding, that they believed your roof was accessible under old neighborhood zoning guidelines. No admission of wrongdoing, no intent to repeat." Mark said nothing. He could hear Gwen flipping through papers on the other end of the line. "But they're requesting mediation," she continued. "They want to resolve this amicably." That word, amicably, stuck in his throat like something too dry to swallow. It wasn't a truce. It was containment. Keep the peace, preserve the image, smooth it all over with just enough language to avoid liability. "You don't have to agree to mediation," Gwen added, "but refusing might trigger another round of procedural games. Your call." He agreed, reluctantly, knowing full well what it meant. A conversation staged not for understanding, but for posture. The meeting was set for the following Monday, hosted in the neutral conference room of a small local law firm neither party had any affiliation with. The room was sterile. Taupe walls, brushed aluminum chairs, a table too wide for comfort but too narrow for real distance. Karen arrived precisely on time, dressed not in her usual pastel leisure wear but in a charcoal gray blazer over a navy blouse, as if she'd dressed for court but softened the tone for diplomacy. She smiled politely, offered a greeting that held the cadence of civility but none of its substance. With her was a younger man. Early 40s, sharp suit, a lawyer more accustomed to real estate closings than disputes of this kind. Gwen was already seated, her notepad open, pen resting at a precise angle. The mediator began with standard protocol, reading a prepared statement about cooperation, mutual respect, and the benefits of resolving conflict without litigation. Then she asked each side to present their version of events. Karen went first. She spoke smoothly, fluidly, as if reciting from memory. We never intended to cause distress. The terrace was, for many years, considered an ideal location for community observation. The understanding, informal though it was, had always been that elevated spaces like that could serve a greater communal purpose. Her voice was steady, her expression serene. We viewed it as an opportunity to build connection, not to impose, certainly not to provoke. Gwen asked one question. Did you or anyone in your household receive explicit written permission to access Mr. Drayton's property at any time? Karen's smile wavered slightly. No, she admitted, but we believed, based on historical records, that there was precedent for shared use. Gwen nodded, scribbled something, said nothing else. Then it was Mark's turn. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't use legal terms. He simply described what had happened, the events, the people, the physical evidence left behind, the photographs, the tampered lights, the note. He ended with a sentence that lingered far longer than it should have. This isn't about misunderstanding. It's about someone deciding that what's mine would be better if it was also theirs. There was no immediate response. Karen's lawyer whispered something to her, but she didn't react. The mediator thanked them both and promised to summarize the discussion and forward recommendations. 2 days later, Gwen received the summary. It was as predictable as it was infuriating. A suggestion that both parties exercise mutual restraint, and that, until zoning questions are clarified, no events be held on the property in question. There was no admission of fault, no consequence, for the unauthorized gatherings, just a temporary pause framed as compromise, but that wasn't the real turning point. The turning point came later that week when a local hardware technician, contracted for unrelated maintenance on the neighborhood's lighting system, texted Mark a photo without context. It was of a laminated diagram tacked to the back wall of the maintenance shed near the community center. The diagram was titled Community Enhancement Projects, 6-Month Outlook. There, listed in neat bullet points beneath beautification and seating installations, was a line that read, Structural approval pending. Rooftop elevation platform. Estimated launch Q3. Mark stared at the image for several minutes. There was no address listed, no names, just the implication that plans were already in motion, that conversations were being had, funding considered, timelines mapped out. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a campaign, a subtle, deliberate annexation disguised as vision. He forwarded the photo to Gwen with a single line. This is what they mean by compromise. He didn't sleep well that night. He lay in bed, listening to the wind outside, to the faint hum of his neighbor's patio heater, to the sounds of a world preparing itself for what it always pretended was progress. And then he got up. Not with panic, but with focus. He opened his laptop, accessed the control interface for the rooftop system, and adjusted the tilt parameters again. He lowered the activation threshold to half its original weight sensitivity. Not enough to throw someone off balance, but enough to make the floor feel uncertain, to make the platform unstable under pressure. He didn't intend to harm anyone, but the roof, his roof, would not remain silent anymore. Under a sky smeared in salt-heavy clouds, the kind that hung low enough to make even the trees feel burdened, Mark found himself staring at his rooftop from the far end of his driveway, coffee untouched in his hand, watching for signs of movement. where there should have been none. Something had shifted again, not the way a house shifts over time with weather and gravity, but the way a battlefield tilts after the enemy starts using your own weapons against you. The new diagram, the community project list Gwen had received just days earlier, wasn't a bluff. It was a blueprint. And if there was one thing Mark had learned over the years, from the cold discipline of consulting, from watching companies dismantle themselves by underestimating their adversaries, it was that those who speak of collaboration while drawing lines on maps are already too deep in their conquest to stop. He climbed the stairs inside, bypassed the bedroom hatch, and unlocked the secondary control panel in the attic, one not connected to any exterior-facing network. This was the version of the rooftop interface he never showed contractors, never mentioned to Gwen. It was raw, firmware level, built into the infrastructure before the system had ever received its commercial GUI overlay. He used it now to do something more fundamental: disable all exterior overrides. The terrace would no longer respond to motion sensors, remote wireless input, or manual overrides unless initiated from inside. No one would be activating anything from the roof itself again. He closed the hatch, double-bolted it, and began compiling a list of materials for a minor yet critical reinforcement project. Not because he intended to barricade himself in, but because the war was already at his door, and he would rather reinforce his walls than beg for understanding from those who had already chosen not to listen. 3 days passed with no direct contact but indirect pressure mounted. The trash collection was skipped without notice. His parcel delivery was delayed, rerouted with a note stating inaccessible location. A vague complaint about excessive rooftop lighting was filed with the City Code Enforcement Office, anonymous, of course, and though nothing came of it, Markey understood the tactic: bureaucratic attrition. Drown him in inconvenience. Make life inch by inch more difficult, more isolated, until he either conceded or snapped. But Mark didn't snap. He documented. He cataloged. He moved with the kind of cold precision that had once made his consulting career profitable, if not exactly enjoyable. Every skipped service, every misrouted delivery, every piece of correspondence was logged, time-stamped, stored in both physical and encrypted digital copies. He hired a local IT security consultant, posing the request not as paranoia but as preparation for a domestic access audit. Within 2 hours, the consultant had confirmed that a signal spoofing device had been used within 20 feet of his house, likely to intercept or scramble the connection between the motion sensors and the central control relay. Someone had not only accessed his rooftop, they had attempted to hijack it. He didn't tell Gwen everything. Not yet. There was still no direct evidence, and Gwen played by rules, by courts and precedents, but Mark knew what was coming. He had seen the signs before, in corporate boardrooms, in committee meetings, in once sane people who believed that the greater good gave them license to repurpose someone else's life. The following weekend confirmed his suspicion. Just past dusk on Saturday, while the sky held that thin line of ember above the water, Mark heard footsteps. Soft, careful, but unmistakably human. He moved to the upstairs window without turning on the light and watched as 4 people stepped onto his rooftop. Not climbing, not sneaking, walking. Calmly, casually. One held a string of lights, another carried a collapsible table. The third was Karen, of course, holding a clipboard and gesturing with her free hand like a cruise director about to assign cabins. The fourth was the nephew again, now dressed like staff. All black, collarless shirt, earpiece hanging from his collar like he'd just left a private event. Mark stayed perfectly still. He watched. He counted. He waited until they had set the table, begun uncoiling the lights, and started placing wine glasses on the wooden surface he had sanded and sealed himself. Only then did he activate the tilt. Not sharply, not as retaliation, but deliberately. The floor groaned. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, the incline began to rise. One of the wine glasses slid an inch, then another. The table legs shifted. Karen paused mid-sentence and turned, staring at the floor like it had betrayed her. The others backed up, confused. The nephew bent down, touched the decking, frowned. Then the platform moved again, not faster, but wider this time, as if shrugging off their presence like water on a duck's back. Karen stepped forward, raising her voice. "Mark, we need to talk about this. This isn't how neighbors behave." But Mark didn't open the hatch. He didn't respond. He returned to his chair, opened his laptop, and recorded the footage from the internal camera feed. The entire interaction. No confrontation, no warning. Just undeniable evidence of coordinated, unauthorized use. He emailed the clip to Gwen with the subject line, "Escalation. No room for mediation." By the time she called him 20 minutes later, Karen and her party had already retreated, but the table remained, as did the lights, now unplugged but still strung across the railing like faded party decorations after a failed event. Gwen's voice was tight. "This gives us leverage," she said. "I'll file an emergency injunction first thing Monday. And I'm contacting a private investigator to confirm if any of their contractors or volunteers received payment. That makes it easier to define intent. But Mark, they're pushing hard. This is coordinated. You might want to consider bringing in external security, not just cameras. Physical presence." Mark agreed, though the idea of uniformed guards patrolling his property made his skin crawl. This wasn't a corporate complex. It was his home. But it wasn't a home anymore, not the way it had been. It was a siege perimeter, a psychological trench. That night someone left a bottle of wine at his door. No note. Just the bottle, wrapped in a cloth napkin with a charm looped around the neck that read, "Community First." The cork was already halfway loose. He threw it out. He had no idea who left it. He didn't want to know, but the symbolism wasn't subtle. Either you drink with us, or you drink alone. The following morning, he met with a construction crew he'd worked with years ago. Men he trusted. Men who didn't ask questions. Together, they installed a low-profile reinforced edge around the rooftop perimeter. Not a fence, nothing visible from the ground, but a retractable frame embedded into the flooring that could rise 6 inches and lock in place. It wasn't about keeping people out. It was about making a statement that the roof was not a shared lounge, not a community terrace, but a line in the sand. The project took 2 days, during which Mark slept downstairs, lights on, door double-locked. He didn't tell Gwen. Not yet. She would have told him to wait for the courts, for the system. But Mark had seen too many systems bend under polite pressure. He would not bend. On the 3rd night after the reinforcement, the lights tripped again. But this time, no one climbed up. Instead, Karen left a printed letter at his door. Not hand-delivered, not mailed, but left under a rock like some kind of suburban ceasefire offering. It read, "Your behavior is deeply concerning. Isolation and aggression are not the marks of responsible residency. The community will no longer engage through private channels. Formal notice forthcoming." It was a threat, a public threat, disguised in passive-aggressive civility. Mark scanned it, logged it, and added it to the dossier. Then he did what they never expected. He went to the next community meeting. Not to speak, not to argue, just to be seen. He stood in the back of the room, arms crossed, face neutral, while Karen spoke about a resident's increasingly adversarial behavior and the importance of shared values. She didn't mention him by name. She didn't have to. But when she asked for a show of hands in favor of reallocating oversight authority for non-ground-level spaces, less than a third of the room responded. Some looked confused. Some looked embarrassed. Others just looked tired. The performance, it seemed, had begun to wear thin. Mark left without saying a word. he didn't need to. The line had been drawn. They could escalate, manipulate, legislate, but they couldn't erase what had already become evident. He wasn't playing their game anymore. He had his own board, his own pieces, and his roof, however temporarily, was once again his. The air was sharper than usual the next evening, tinged with the metallic tang of sea breeze filtered through rows of concrete and ornamental shrubbery. It was the kind of cool that reached beneath collars and curled under doors, pushing its way in like an uninvited guest. Mark felt it as he stood by the window, the same window he'd watched them from so many times now. But tonight, there was no subtlety, no misdirection, no disguise. They came like they had a right to it. It began around 6:45 p.m., just before the last light dropped behind the horizon. A low hum of conversation drifted up from the side street. Footsteps approached. Multiple, uneven, deliberate. Chairs scraped against pavement. Then the first voice, high-pitched, performative, Karen's unmistakable cadence. She wasn't pretending anymore. She wasn't hiding behind letters or association bulletins. She was announcing, declaring. A chorus of glasses clinked together, the muffled pop of a cork, soft laughter floating upward as if the roof was just another venue in a city where boundaries meant nothing. Mark didn't need to check the surveillance. He already knew what he would see. The table returned, decorated more deliberately now, with a small floral centerpiece, wine buckets, and even paper menus fanned across the surface. Someone had set up a small portable speaker at the edge, barely loud enough to call music, but intentional enough to set a tone. Casual ownership. He watched the monitor for 23 seconds. That's how long it took for the boiling in his stomach to sharpen into something focused, something practiced. His fingers moved without hesitation, unlocking the rooftop override. The control panel glowed quietly under his touch, lines of code scrolling beneath the interface. A language only he spoke here. He disabled the elevation limit, increased the tilt range from 10 degrees to 17. Not dangerous, not technically, but enough to make the surface unpredictable, enough to strip away the illusion of control they'd grown so comfortable with. He didn't activate it immediately. He waited. Let them settle in. Let the second glass of wine be poured. Let Karen raise her voice over the hum of the evening and say something smug and irreversible, something like, "This is what the community is about." Then he pressed the sequence. The floor responded as if exhaling. Slowly, the slope began to shift, silent at first, imperceptible to those lost in their own self-satisfaction. Then came the motion. One chair began to drift. A wine glass tipped. Laughter turned to confusion, then to alarm. The speaker tilted and slid across the surface, stopping at the edge of the railing. Someone shouted. Karen's voice cut through, panicked but still clinging to authority. "Everyone remain calm. It's just the decking." Just a little movement. But the floor didn't stop. It shifted again, more abruptly this time, not enough to knock someone down, but enough to make them question every step. Mark could hear them now. The frantic shuffle of feet, the scraping of chair legs as guests tried to stabilize themselves, the slap of a glass hitting the floor and shattering. A woman yelled something about her ankle. The speaker crashed against the railing and cut out. The light strings shook. Karen tried to issue instructions again, but her voice was drowned by motion, by panic, by the sound of entitlement unmooring itself from certainty. Then he stopped it. Just like that. Tilt returned to neutral. The decking stilled. The surface rebalanced, but the damage was already done. They looked around in silence now, scattered, unsteady. Someone had fallen to one knee, cradling a bottle like it might save them. Another stood with both hands on the railing, white-knuckled. Karen turned to the hatch as if expecting it to swing open and reveal him, the villain of her narrative, the unreasonable recluse who couldn't understand progress. But it didn't open. Instead, Mark picked up his phone and placed a single call. Not to Gwen, not to the police, but to the private security contact Gwen had recommended 3 weeks prior. He had ignored the suggestion then, considering it excessive. Tonight, he didn't. "This is Drayden," he said. "Schedule the overnight post, starting tonight. No contact. Observation only." The voice on the other end simply replied, "Understood." He returned to the window, watching as the guests regrouped. Some began leaving, cautiously, helping each other climb back across the shared wall they should never have crossed in the first place. One woman abandoned her shoes entirely, stepping barefoot across the decking like a child caught sneaking out. Karen was the last to leave. She stood near the railing for several minutes, staring down at the speaker now lying silent and cracked near the corner, before finally stepping back and disappearing over the parapet. Mark didn't move until he heard the last set of footsteps hit the ground below. Then he reset the control system, activated the security override, and engaged the perimeter alarms. From now on, any motion over 10 pounds would trigger a silent alert to both his phone and the security service. There would be no more warnings, no more performances. At exactly 10:15 p.m., a notification buzzed on his phone. An anonymous message. No sender, just text. "We see who you really are now." He stared at it, unmoved. He didn't respond. Instead, he documented it, saved the image, filed it. Another piece of the growing archive. The next morning brought another letter from the neighborhood office, this time certified, stamped, and notarized. It accused him of creating a hazardous condition through negligent design, and demanded he submit to a property inspection within 5 business days. The language was bureaucratic, but the intent was not. This was retaliation. One last desperate reach by those who had lost control of the narrative and were now trying to regain it through procedural force. He forwarded the letter to Gwen, who replied with a single sentence, "We've crossed into liability warfare. I'm escalating to the county." He knew what that meant. Hearings, filings, possibly depositions, but he also knew what it didn't mean. It didn't mean they'd stop. They wouldn't. Not until they'd either forced him into surrender or rewritten the story enough times that the community forgot who had started it. But the rooftop wouldn't forget. And neither would Mark. Because this wasn't about a roof anymore. It hadn't been for a long time. This was about the idea that someone could see a space, covet it, and decide they had a claim to it. About the arrogance of people who mistake silence for permission, and persistence for principle. And about the quiet power of saying no, not once, but relentlessly, unflinchingly, until there was nothing left for them to misunderstand. The morning after the certified letter arrived, the fog rolled in heavier than usual, muffling sound and flattening the world into a quiet, gray void where every movement felt suspended. Mark stood at the edge of his kitchen, coffee forgotten on the counter, watching the blurred outline of his rooftop through the window as if it might shift again, morph into something new, or worse, return to something it had never truly been. The weight of the past few weeks hadn't caught up to him until now. He wasn't exhausted in the physical sense, not the kind that a good night's sleep could remedy, but in that deeper, more corrosive way that eats through a person's sense of place and certainty. The rooftop, once a simple architectural feature, had become a battleground. The kind of battleground where the war is never declared, only assumed, and every act of defense is reframed as aggression. That day, Gwen called with a tone in her voice he hadn't heard since the beginning. Not urgency, not alarm, but resolution. "They've filed a formal claim through the county dispute board," she said, "but it won't go anywhere. Their basis is weak, their evidence circumstantial. I've submitted your footage, diagrams, witness statements, even the altered lighting components. They're playing at legitimacy, but it's smoke." She paused, then added, "Still, I'm recommending you meet with a structural assessor. Independent, your pick. Not for their sake, but to document compliance in case they try to escalate to city-level review. He agreed, and within 24 hours the inspection was done. The assessor, a calm, middle-aged man named Foster, confirmed what Mark already knew. Everything was code-compliant. The tilt system was non-threatening under residential standards, and the property was private in every applicable sense. The report was stamped and filed. But something else had begun to shift, quietly, almost invisibly beneath the veneer of the neighborhood's well-manicured shrubs and pastel-painted homes. Mark noticed it in small ways. Neighbors who had previously avoided eye contact now offered brief nods, a few even mumbling short greetings as they passed. One elderly man who lived 2 streets over dropped off a set of discarded floor tiles with a note, "Thought you might need spare parts." I saw what they did. It wasn't an alliance. Mark didn't want one. But it was recognition. And sometimes recognition is its own form of resistance. Karen, for her part, had gone quiet. The bulletin board she once curated with obsessive dedication now sat half-empty. Her yard, once trimmed weekly to military precision, showed signs of neglect. The string lights across her balcony were taken down. Word spread that she had been reprimanded privately by the board after an internal review found that the newsletter she'd used to promote the rooftop events had not been sanctioned. She remained in her house, of course. People like Karen don't leave when they lose. They stay, hoping to outlast the silence. But the grip she held had weakened, not in a dramatic collapse, but in that steady, irreversible way that power always does when people stop pretending it's earned. Mark, meanwhile, had begun to reoccupy the rooftop in quiet, private ways. He added a new bench near the edge, lower to the deck with a weighted base to prevent easy movement. He reinstalled a wind chime. Subtle, not for ambiance but as a low-tech alert for motion. He returned to watering his succulents in the mornings, keeping a log of soil conditions like he used to before the rooftop had become public terrain. But he didn't host. He didn't share. The space had been defended, not reclaimed. There was no celebration, only return. And the return was enough. A final letter arrived 3 weeks later. It was from the city's Residential Oversight Committee. After a brief investigation prompted by the anonymous complaints, they had closed the file. No violations found. No further action recommended. The note was short, impersonal, but definitive. Gwen forwarded a scanned copy with a highlighted section. Resident has demonstrated appropriate measures of property security, code adherence, and non-public designation. Underneath, she wrote, "This ends it. Legally, at least." Mark saved the file, printed 2 copies, and archived one with the rest of his documentation. The other he folded once and slipped beneath the floorboards of the rooftop storage bench. Not as a trophy, as a reminder. In the end, there was no last confrontation. No cinematic moment of apology